18 men died in the Wheelvore mine in Cornwall on the morning of January 14th, 1709. Not from a collapse, not from an explosion. They drowned, standing upright in tunnels they had dug with their own hands. The groundwater rose around them, inch by inch, with no way out. That was the reality of early industrial England. The coal that heated homes, forged iron, and fueled the ambitions of an empire was trapped underground, locked behind walls of water that no human force could move. Until one man asked a question no one had thought to ask before: what if fire could do the lifting? To understand why the locomotive mattered, you first have to understand how people moved before it existed. In the early 1700s, the fastest a human being could travel over land was the speed of a galloping horse, roughly 25 miles per hour for a very short distance, under ideal conditions. Most goods moved at 2 to 4 miles per hour by ox cart along unpaved roads that turned into rivers of mud every winter. A journey from London to Edinburgh took 2 weeks. Moving a ton of coal from a mine to a city 30 miles away cost nearly as much as the coal itself was worth. England was booming. Textile mills, ironworks, glass houses demanding staggering quantities of fuel. But the fuel was underground, and the underground was filling with water. Mine operators faced a brutal arithmetic. The deeper you dug for coal, the more water you found. Pumping that water out by hand, by horse, or by windmill was backbreaking, expensive, and ultimately futile. The mines were losing the race against their own geology. Into that crisis stepped a military engineer named Thomas Savery. In 1698, he received a patent for what he called the miner's friend, a device that used steam pressure to suck water upward through a pipe. It was crude, dangerous, and prone to explosion, but it worked after a fashion. Savery traveled through English mining country demonstrating his invention to skeptical operators. The machine was a sensation and a disaster. Its maximum lift was limited by the strength of steam, and early boilers regularly burst, killing operators and bystanders alike. Even so, the idea had taken root that fire can create pressure and pressure can do work. The question was how to harness it without blowing up everyone in the vicinity. That question would occupy the next 30 years of English engineering, and it would be answered not by a university-educated scientist, but by a blacksmith. Thomas Newcomen was born in Dartmouth, Devon, in 1664. He was an ironmonger who supplied tools and equipment to the Cornish tin and copper mines. He watched miners drown and operators despair, and he spent decades quietly working on a solution in a workshop behind his house. His neighbors thought him eccentric. His wife reportedly called his machine the Great Noisemaker. In 1712, Newcomen erected the world's first practical steam engine at Dudley Castle in the English Midlands. It was not elegant. It was enormous, the size of a small house, belching steam from every joint and banging with a rhythmic seismic clunk that could be heard half a mile away. It pumped water slowly, inefficiently, burning enormous quantities of coal to produce modest results. But it worked, reliably, day after day. Within 15 years, more than 100 Newcomen engines were operating across England. The mines could go deeper, more coal could be reached. The engine that burned coal had unlocked the coal that would power the next century of engines, a beautiful, terrible, self-reinforcing loop. The story every American schoolchild is told, that James Watt invented the steam engine while watching a kettle boil, is almost entirely false. What Watt actually did, beginning in 1764, was far more interesting and far more consequential. Watt was a scientific instrument maker at the University of Glasgow when he was asked to repair a model of a Newcomen engine. As he worked on it, he was struck by a single devastating inefficiency. The engine wasted most of its energy heating and recooling the same cylinder over and over. Every stroke of the piston required filling the cylinder with steam, then condensing that steam with cold water to create the vacuum that pushed the piston down. It worked, but it consumed fuel at a rate that made it economically useless for anything except draining mines. Watt's insight was deceptively simple. Separate the condenser. And if the steam was condensed in a separate chamber, the main cylinder could stay hot permanently, while an efficiency would leak. He spent 11 years and his entire personal fortune and the fortune of his business partner, Matthew Boulton, perfecting the design. And in 1776, the first Watt engine entered commercial service. It used roughly a quarter of the fuel of a comparable Newcomen engine. But Watt didn't stop there. He added a second crucial innovation, rotary motion. Okay, it's the early engines produced only up and down movement, useful only for pumping. Watt devised a system of gears and cranks that converted the piston's back and forth stroke into continuous rotation. Suddenly, the steam engine could turn a shaft, and a shaft could turn a wheel, and a wheel could move a vehicle. The locomotive in that moment became theoretically possible. It would take another generation to make it real. On Christmas Eve, 1801, a crowd of 40 men, women, and children gathered around a vehicle unlike anything the world had ever seen. It stood 8 feet tall. It hissed steam from every joint. It smelled of hot iron and coal smoke. The man at the controls was Richard Trevithick, and 29 years old, built like a prize fighter with a laugh that carried over the engine noise. And she said what happened next was witnessed by astonished Cornish villagers who had never seen anything move under its own power. The machine climbed Camborne Hill, like a steep rise that would wind a horse away, carrying 8 passengers at 4 miles per hour. They called it the Puffing Devil. It ran for 3 days. Then Trevithick and his friends, celebrating their success at a local inn, forgot to let off the steam. The boiler ran dry, the engine overheated, and the Puffing Devil, the world's first self-propelled passenger vehicle, burned to the ground in a Cornish field on December 28, 1801. The name James Watt is known to every schoolchild in the English-speaking world. The name Richard Trevithick is known to almost no one outside Cornwall and a small circle of engineering historians. That is one of the great injustices of industrial history. Trevithick was the man who actually put the steam engine on wheels. More than that, he understood something that Watt had explicitly denied was possible. Watt believed high-pressure steam was too dangerous to use in a mobile engine. He lobbied against it politically and professionally, using his enormous influence to stifle competitors. Trevithick, working at the margins of the industry in rural Cornwall, simply ignored him. High-pressure steam was the key. A high-pressure engine could be small and powerful enough to propel itself. Watt's low-pressure engines required condensers so large they were the size of buildings. They could never move. In February 1804, Trevithick made history in the Welsh town of Merthyr Tydfil. A local ironmaster named Samuel Homfrey had bet his rival 500 guineas, an enormous sum, roughly $80,000 today, that a steam engine could haul 10 tons of iron 9 miles along the Merthyr tram road. The locomotive Trevithick built weighed 5 tons, ran on cast iron rails, and achieved a top speed of just over 5 miles per hour with its full load. On February 21st, 1804, it completed the journey, with several stops for repairs and to clear obstacles from the track. But it completed it. Homfrey won his bet. The railway age had technically begun. The locomotive itself was soon abandoned. The cast iron rails weren't designed for its weight and cracked repeatedly under the stress. Trevithick tried again in London in 1808. Building a circular demonstration track and charging spectators 1 shilling to watch his locomotive, which he called Catch Me Who Can, run laps. It drew crowds. It broke down regularly. And then Trevithick ran out of money. By 1816, he had abandoned railway development entirely and sailed for Peru to work on steam-powered mining operations in the Andes. He didn't return to England for 11 years. When he did, he was broke. He died in 1833 in a Dartford inn with nothing to his name. His funeral was paid for by workers at the local ironworks. Think about that for a moment. The man who invented the self-propelled vehicle, who opened the door for every car, train, and bus that ever existed, was buried with money donated by factory workers. No ceremony, no recognition, while others would grow enormously rich from what he had created. Why? Trevithick was a brilliant engineer and a catastrophic businessman. He sold his patents too cheaply, failed to protect his intellectual property, and had a remarkable talent for choosing the wrong financial partners. But there was a structural problem too. The technology was ahead of the infrastructure. Without suitable rails and a funding model to build them, the locomotive was impressive but commercially marginal. That problem would be solved not by an engineer, but by a coal miner's son from Northumberland who had never received a single day of formal schooling in his life. George Stephenson was 43 years old when he stood before a committee of the British Parliament and proposed building a railway. He spoke with such a thick Northumberland accent that half the committee couldn't understand him. He had no university degree, no formal engineering training, no experience with anything beyond colliery engines. And one committee member openly mocked him. Another asked him to repeat himself. 20 years later, every railway in Britain and most railways in the world were built on principles that George Stephenson had established. He is, without exaggeration, one of the most consequential engineers in human history. Stephenson was born in 1781 in the village of Wylam, Northumberland, a coal mining community where children were put to work as young as 8 years old. His father operated a pumping engine at a local colliery. George spent his childhood as a herd boy, guiding cows across the Wylam Wagonway, a primitive horse-drawn rail system for moving coal, while engines like the one his father tended chuffed and hissed on either side of the track. He couldn't read or write until he was 18 years old. When he finally learned, he paid for his own evening classes, walking miles through the Northumberland dark to sit in a schoolroom with children a decade younger than himself. What he had, instead of education, was an extraordinary gift for mechanical intuition. He could disassemble and reassemble any engine in the north of England, often diagnosing problems that stumped qualified engineers. In 1814, Stephenson built his first locomotive, which he called Blucher, at Killingworth Colliery. It was not a masterpiece. It was slow, mechanically crude, and consumed coal at a rate that made the colliery managers nervous, but Stephenson kept improving, and with each iteration, he learned something new about the relationship between a steam engine, its wheels, and the rails beneath it. The key insight he developed at Killingworth was the importance of the rail-wheel interface. Early locomotives often slipped on wet or uneven rails, their driving wheels spinning uselessly. Stephenson experimented obsessively with wheel flanges, rail profiles, and the weight distribution of the locomotive, developing what would become the standard configuration for railway operation. He was also solving a problem no one had clearly articulated: the need for a standard gauge. Different railways were being built to different widths, making it impossible for a locomotive built for one line to run on another. Stephenson advocated relentlessly, and eventually successfully, for a standard gauge of 4 feet 8.5 inches. Why that specific measurement? Almost certainly because it matched the gauge of the Killingworth wagonway, which itself derived from the width of Roman roads. An accident of ancient Roman engineering had become the global standard for rail travel. In 1821, Stephenson was appointed engineer for an ambitious project, a railway connecting the coal mines near Darlington with the port of Stockton on the northeast coast of England. The Stockton and Darlington Railway, which opened on September 27, 1825, was the first steam-powered railway in history to carry paying passengers. On opening day, Stephenson himself drove the locomotive locomotion number. One at speeds of up to 24 miles per hour, pulling a train of 38 wagons and coaches carrying approximately 600 passengers. It was the largest single human movement by mechanical power in history to that point. The crowd that gathered along the 12-mile route numbered in the tens of thousands. Horsemen galloped alongside the locomotive. Children ran after it, screaming with excitement and terror. Farmers leaned on their fences and watched with expressions ranging from wonder to absolute bewilderment. One eyewitness described a perfect madness of excitement, as if the world were coming apart and reassembling itself into a new and incomprehensible shape. The pivotal moment in railway history came in October 1829, when the newly formed Liverpool and Manchester Railway Company held a public competition to determine which locomotive design would power their line, the first intercity railway in the world. The competition, held at Rainhill, near Liverpool, required entrants to haul a load equal to 3 times their own weight over a 1.5-mile course at no less than 10 miles per hour for a total of 70 miles, simulating a full working day. 5 locomotives entered, 3 failed mechanically before completing the trials. The 4th, a novelty called the Cyclopede, was powered by a horse walking on a treadmill. It was disqualified when the horse fell through the floor. The 5th was Stephenson's rocket, built in collaboration with his son Robert and engineer Henry Booth. The rocket was not the fastest or most powerful locomotive ever built, but it combined for the first time all the key innovations that would define steam locomotive design for the next century. A multi-tube boiler for maximum heat transfer, a separate firebox, steam exhaust directed up the chimney, and direct drive between piston and wheels. It completed the trial distance at an average speed of 12 miles per hour, so it can hit a top speed of 30 miles per hour. Faster than any land vehicle had ever traveled in human history. The crowd went silent, then erupted. The railway age had found its machine. There's a photograph that is one of the most famous in American history. 2 locomotives face each other nose to nose at a place called Promontory Summit in the Utah desert. Around them stand hundreds of men, the railroad executives, politicians, engineers, workers. So someone is holding a bottle of champagne, or someone else has a sledgehammer. What the photograph does not show, the 10,000 Chinese laborers who drove the Central Pacific's rails east through the Sierra Nevada and across the Nevada desert. The thousands of Irish immigrants who drove the Union Pacific's rails west across the Great Plains, the Sioux and Cheyenne warriors whose lands were being cut in half. This is the photograph of a celebration. The story of how it came to be taken is something else entirely. By 1840, the United States had more railroad track than all of Europe combined. The country was vast, its geography daunting, its economy increasingly dependent on moving agricultural products from the interior to coastal ports. The canals that had carried commerce in the early republic were too slow, too dependent on water levels, and impossible to build across mountains. The railroad was not a luxury in America, it was a geographical necessity. Building a railroad in 19th century America was the most capital-intensive activity a human being could undertake. A single mile of track required, depending on terrain, between $15,000 and $50,000 in 1860 dollars, roughly $500,000 to $1.5 million today. For a transcontinental line stretching nearly 2,000 miles, the numbers were incomprehensible to ordinary investors. The solution was government subsidy on a scale that would be politically unimaginable today. The Pacific Railroad Act of 1862 granted the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroads more than 175 million acres of public land, an area larger than Texas, as well as $16,000 to $48,000 per mile in government loans, depending on terrain. In return, the railroads were to build the line, carry government freight and troops at reduced rates, and theoretically open the West to settlement. Now, what actually happened was more complicated. The railroad companies, particularly the Union Pacific, created shell corporations, most famously the Crédit Mobilier, that awarded construction contracts to themselves at inflated prices and distributed the profits to company insiders and compliant politicians. When the Crédit Mobilier scandal broke in 1872, it implicated the sitting vice president of the United States and a dozen members of Congress. It was the largest corruption scandal in American history up to that point, and it barely slowed the railroads down. The Union Pacific drove west from Omaha, Nebraska, where its workforce was dominated by Irish immigrants, many of them Civil War veterans, managed by former Union Army officers who organized the work camps with military precision. 10-hour days, 6 days a week. The Central Pacific drove east from Sacramento, California, across terrain that made the Great Plains look like a park. The Sierra Nevada rose to elevations of over 7,000 feet in a distance of 50 miles, then dropped into the Nevada desert. The Central Pacific's initial workforce, mostly white laborers, refused the hardest work, demanded higher wages, and quit in large numbers. The company's superintendent, Charles Crocker, proposed an experiment: hire Chinese workers. His colleagues were skeptical. Chinese men were small, they said. They wouldn't be strong enough. Crocker replied, "They built the Great Wall of China, or didn't they?" By 1866, 9 out of 10 Central Pacific workers were Chinese, approximately 12,000 men, many recruited directly from Guangdong province. They earned $26 to $35 a month, provided their own food and lodging, and took on the most dangerous assignments, hand drilling into granite cliff faces, lowering themselves in wicker baskets to place black powder charges. And in the winter of 1866 to 1867, working through snow drifts 40 feet deep in tunnels under the snow, moving by lantern light for weeks at a time. When Chinese workers struck for higher wages in June 1867, Crocker cut off their food supply. They returned to work within a week. Their names were not recorded in any official document. No Chinese worker appears in the famous photograph at Promontory Summit. So the Transcontinental Railroad also passed through the heart of the Great Plains, the territory of the Sioux, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Pawnee, and dozens of other nations. The U.S. government had signed treaties guaranteeing these tribes sovereignty over their lands. The railroad made those treaties obsolete almost immediately. As construction moved west, the railroad hired professional hunters, including a young buffalo hunter named William Cody, who would later become famous as Buffalo Bill, who used to kill bison by the thousands to feed the construction gangs. And in 1868 alone, an estimated 1.5 million bison were killed along the railroad corridor. The Plains tribes, whose entire economy, diet, and spiritual life was built around the bison herds, watched their world disappear in less than a decade. General William Tecumseh Sherman, commanding the U.S. Army in the West, understood exactly what was happening and welcomed it. The railroad did not cause the destruction of Native American Plains culture, but it accelerated it to a pace that no military campaign alone could have achieved. In 1877, Cornelius Vanderbilt's railroad empire generated more revenue than the entire federal government of the United States. And Vanderbilt himself was worth approximately $100 million, roughly $3 billion today. He was the richest man in America. And in the same year, railroad workers across America were making $1.75 a day. They had just received their third consecutive pay cut in 4 years. On July 16th, 1877, in Martinsburg, West Virginia, they stopped working. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 spread to every major railroad in America within 48 hours. By July 20th, through 2/3 of all rail traffic in the United States had stopped. The response of state and federal governments was to deploy military force. In Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, when soldiers opened fire on a crowd of strikers and bystanders, the crowd fought back. The Pittsburgh Railroad Depot was burned to the ground. 25 people died. It was the bloodiest labor conflict in American history to that point. The strike failed. Workers returned without their demands being met. But something had changed. The railroad barons had revealed that maintaining their profits required military force against American citizens. A labor movement that had been scattered and disorganized began to coalesce into something more permanent. The Knights of Labor, the Brotherhoods of Railway Workers, and ultimately the American Federation of Labor were all shaped by the rage and solidarity of 1877. The political response to railroad monopoly power was slow, contested, and ultimately transformative for American governance. The Interstate Commerce Act of 1887, which created the Interstate Commerce Commission, was the first federal regulatory agency in American history, born directly from public outrage at railroad rate discrimination. The real turning point came with the Hepburn Act of 1906, which gave the ICC genuine power to set maximum freight rates. Theodore Roosevelt used the Sherman Antitrust Act aggressively against railroad combinations. Every federal regulatory agency that exists today, the FCC, the FDA, the FTC, is, in a direct line of descent, the child of the fight over railroad rates. Because the locomotive had forced the creation of the modern American regulatory state. Between 1945 and 1960, every major American railroad retired its steam locomotives. The process took less than 15 years, a technology that had taken a century and a half to develop, that had reshaped every aspect of human civilization, was replaced almost overnight. To understand what the steam locomotive actually did to human civilization, consider a single number. In 1800, the fastest human beings had ever traveled on land was approximately 25 miles per hour for a very short distance. By 1900, passenger trains in England and America regularly traveled 60 to 80 miles per hour over long distances. In a single century, the maximum speed of land travel had tripled, after having remained essentially constant for all of human history up to that point. The consequences cascaded through every aspect of life. Cities that had been defined by the distance a person could walk, roughly a mile from center to edge, exploded outward along rail lines, creating the suburbs Americans now take for granted. Time itself was standardized. Before the railroad, every town set its clocks by local solar noon, meaning Boston was 11 minutes ahead of New York. The railroads, unable to publish coherent timetables under such conditions, forced the adoption of standard time zones in 1883, dividing the continent into 4 zones. The government did not create time zones, the railroads did. The locomotive was also the first technology to burn fossil fuels at an industrial scale across the North American landscape. The forests that once covered much of the eastern United States were devastated, not primarily by farming or urban expansion, but by the railroad, which consumed wood for fuel in its early decades at a rate that stripped entire mountain ranges in New England and Appalachia, and which required wooden railroad ties at a rate of about 2,500 per mile of track, totaling hundreds of millions of ties nationwide. Coal-burning locomotives blanketed rail corridors with soot, and passengers on long-distance trains regularly arrived at their destinations gray with coal dust. Railroad fire, from sparks thrown by locomotive smokestacks, was a major cause of forest fires throughout the 19th century, due to a fact so well documented that some states held railroads legally liable for fire damage to adjacent property. The environmental costs of the railroad age were enormous, largely invisible to those living through it, and laid the groundwork for the industrial-scale environmental destruction of the 20th century. The locomotive taught America and the world that burning fossil fuels was the normal, acceptable default way of doing things. It was not the last technology to do so. The metallurgy developed to build better boilers and rails became the foundation of structural steel and the skyscrapers of Chicago and New York. The precision machining techniques developed for locomotive manufacture became the basis of the American machine tool industry that would build the weapons of 2 world wars. The management structures created to run vast rail networks became the template for the modern corporation. Thomas Newcomen, working in a Dartmouth workshop in the 1700s, could not have imagined any of this. George Stephenson, illiterate until adulthood, had no theoretical framework for what he was doing. He worked by intuition and incremental improvement, solving one problem at a time. Richard Trevithick died broke. James Watt died famous, almost all of them. From the navvies who dug the earthworks to the engineers who designed the locomotives, from the mine owners who funded the experiments to the railroad barons who monetized the results, would have been astonished by the world their work produced. The steam locomotive was not invented by a single genius in a single moment of inspiration. It was built by hundreds of people over more than a century. Blacksmiths and scientists, entrepreneurs and speculators, immigrants and indigenous peoples, financiers and workers. Most of them were trying to solve a specific immediate problem. How to pump water from a mine, how to move coal from a pit, how to get across a mountain range. None of them set out to transform civilization. Civilization was transformed anyway. That is the deepest lesson of the locomotive age. Technologies are never just technologies. They are social processes, economic forces, political events. The steam engine didn't happen in a laboratory. It happened in a world of specific human conflicts over power, money, and survival. Its consequences were not the inevitable results of technical progress. They were the results of choices made by specific people in specific circumstances for specific reasons. Choices about who would work, who would profit, whose land would be taken, whose culture would be destroyed, whose children would breathe the smoke. We live in the world the locomotive built. Its rails are still in the ground. Its fuel is still in the air. The iron giants are quiet now, but the world they made is not.